lovely people, my name is Emma and today I am doing the Book Riot Read Harder 2020 challenge. So Book Riot put out a challenge every year which is 24 very specific prompts with the intention of trying to diversify and widen your reading, both in terms of genre but also author and representation, and fiction and non-fiction, and also format as well. They're very good at trying to just spread it out to read just wider in general. Now I look at it sometimes, but I tend not to go for them just because I have so many books on my shelf already and I read so kind of disparately already that I don't necessarily feel like I particularly need something like this to sort of push out my reading. However, what I thought would be fun to do today is to go back to the Book Riot 2020 challenge and look at how many of these challenges did I actually end up meeting throughout the year, just because of the sheer kind of range of books that I tend to read anyway. So I have gone through and already found books to fit from it because I didn't want to kind of be running around my house during filming, and I can let you know that I managed to do 17 out of the 24, which is 70%, which I'm quite impressed with. But let's find out what books I read that met the various criteria. So the first challenge was YA non-fiction, and for that one I read All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. This is a combination of a memoir and manifesto. It is YA non-fiction and it's about George M. Johnson growing up and being gay, and it's about him kind of exploring his sexuality and various sort of notes for the future, hopefulness, messages to younger audiences who will be reading it and hopefully trying to kind of find some hope for themselves. Also, some of it is kind of writing to various relatives in his life about what they mean to him. It's sort of a mishmash style of book that, like it says, is half memoir and half manifesto. It has some very intense moments and generally was very beautiful. It is written for a YA audience, which meant that like I am not its target audience, and I did feel that as I was reading it, but that is not the fault of the book, that is the fault of me. But yeah, it was generally a lovely one, and I think if you are interested in kind of queer literature and queer non-fiction, and also would like to dabble with YA non-fiction, which is an interesting subgenre I really don't hear much about at all, this one was a great read in general. The next one is a retelling of a classic fairy tale myth by an author of colour, and for that one I have Ayesha at Last by Umza Jalaluddin. This is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but it is a Muslim retelling, and it is there's kind of a twist because there's a mistaken identity in it, which I do not remember in the original. It's a really fun contemporary romance that I definitely enjoyed, and I did enjoy the kind of Pride and Prejudice twist on top of it, and there was a really lovely discussion in it as well about religion, because one of the characters, the guy in the relationship, is a lot more devout than the woman. It's kind of a conversation about what it means to be devout, kind of religiously devout, and sort of how do you interact with somebody who isn't, and kind of what importance does that have within a relationship in general. So really good fun, lots of kind of classic tropey mistaken identity bits in there as well, which I greatly appreciated. The next one I'm stretching a little bit, which is a mystery where the victim is not a woman, and for that I have Macbeth by Jo Nesbo. This is a retelling of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Clearly it has the same name. It's part of the Hogarth Shakespeare collection, which is where the publishing company kind of commission these retellings from various big name authors. Jo Nesbo is a fairly big Scandinavian crime writer, and this one very much follows in that train of thought, and it is about corrupt police and kind of drug cartels, and it's just generally really, really good fun. The main victim in this is not a woman, it's one of the guys. It's I can't remember who. I can't remember the names of any of the characters, it's been too long. Clearly my Shakespeare is rusty and my mum's going to be horrified at me for not knowing this, but I had a really good time with it. I don't know if it technically counts as a mystery as well, or if it's just kind of a thriller as such, but I mean consider them close enough. And one thing I really enjoyed about this is when you remove a lot of the kind of archaic flowery language and sort of the old-fashioned settings of Shakespeare, and you put it into a modern context, you can really see just how ridiculous his underlying plot structure is and how absurd how many of the characters act. Like Macbeth goes from no murder to yes murder in about a page and a half, and I really appreciate that in my characters. Just let's just throw out all kind of internal sense and just make them do bizarre stuff for the hell of it. So greatly appreciated this book. The next book is a graphic memoir, and I did actually read one this year. I do do really want to read more of them next year because I only read one. But that was Sensible Footwear, A Girl's Guide by Kate Charlesworth. This is a memoir of Kate's time coming out in part of the queer community, but it also doubles as a look at the LGBTQ+ history that has happened kind of over the years. It is stunning as far as graphic novels go, but the graphic novel format does make it kind of difficult to keep track of the information because there are lots of pages where style is potentially favoured over usability and kind of readability of the page. But I really enjoyed it, and like I said, I definitely want to check out more memoirs within this sort of format because I do think it's a really interesting way of learning about somebody's life, and I want to read more graphic novels in general, non-fiction graphic novels. I should check them out more. The next prompt is a book about a natural disaster, and for that one I have The Ends of the World by Peter Brannen. You have heard me talk about this book so many times on my channel before. It's about the 5 mass extinction events that Earth has gone through in its history, so naturally there are a fair number of natural disasters in there. We've got volcanoes, we've got asteroids, we've got earthquakes, we've got tsunamis, we've got the whole hog if I'm entirely honest. It's a really great look at paleontology and the history of the planet in general, because to talk about the extinction events you do need to talk about what was happening just before and what life was going on. So it really for me opened up my eyes to more about paleontology than just dinosaurs, which will always be my first love, but this has made me interested in so many more other things like trilobites and the Cambrian period and so many cool things that happened out there. It also is a really interesting look at climate change because it's very difficult to talk about previous extinction events without looking at some of the scary parallels that there are with what is going on in our kind of current climate today. So fantastic book all around. Now the next prompt is the first one that I don't actually have a book for, and that is a play by a person of colour or a queer author, and I just haven't read any plays this year, which to be honest I don't actually ever read any plays. This is something I was thinking about changing, but I find plays as a format very difficult to read, and I honestly just prefer seeing the plays. So I don't feel too bad about this one. However, if you did read any good plays this year by either a person of colour or queer author, please do let me know in the comments down below and maybe I'll check them out. The next prompt is a historical fiction not set in World War II, and I had so many different options for this because I really enjoy historical fiction, and this year it has been really good at branching out to read things other than World War II. But the one I wanted to talk about is Minette Walters' The Turn of Midnight, which is book 2 in her duology about the Black Death. This was an incredible character study. It is about a small village that in the time of the Black Death, and it is about them kind of becoming a close-knit community, and it is the various characters trying to deal with what has happened there. There's a lot of tension between the French and the British in this because it was when we were under Normandy rule, and just generally there's all sorts of conversations about kind of class and what it means to be a serf and what it means to be a nobleman, and trying to break down the idea of like God-given kind of rights. And Minette Walters is incredible at doing really wonderful believable character arcs and really building up believable character pictures, not just for her main cast but for like every individual kind of character around them, both on a secondary and tertiary level. I really enjoyed it, would totally recommend. The first book is called The Last Hours, I believe. Go check it out. Then we have another one that I did not do, and that is an audiobook of poetry, because again, I don't read any poetry. I don't listen to any poetry either. And if you have a recommendation of an audiobook of poems that you think I should check out, please do let me know in the comments down below. The next prompt is the last book in a series, and I do have a couple because I really made a conscious effort of trying to finish off some series that I have on the go this year, and I will be continuing that next year because I always read the first book in a series and never seem to finish them, which I do feel guilty about as a reader. So the one I've kind of picked for this is The Winter of the Witch, which is book 3 of the Winter Night trilogy. This is set in medieval Russia and has got a lot of medieval folklore and Russian folklore, and it's about kind of the clash between the old religions and the new. Book 1 is The Bear and the Nightingale. It's very popular, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it here, but fantastic book, great wrap up of the series, and the best slow burn romance I've ever read. The next prompt is a rural setting, and because I did a Springathon where we had so much nature writing, again I had many options for this, but one of my absolute highlights from that reading 2 weeks was Waterfalls of Stars by Rosanne Alexander. This is my 10 years on the island of Skoma. Skoma is a tiny island off the coast of Britain which is very much kind of a wildlife nature reserve, and there is always somebody appointed or a couple appointed who are supposed to be kind of wardens of the island. They do various kind of jobs for conservation, and they just kind of keep an eye on things in general, and it's about Rosanne's experiences being on the island for the 10 years and living in that total isolation. It is absolutely stunning. It's the most rural of rural settings you can get because they are literally the only human beings on this island for most of the year, and it's just amazing because you get to read about seals and puffins and just beautiful things in general, and I would 100% recommend it. It's a fantastic book. The next prompt is a debut novel by a queer author, and for this I'm going to be talking about Art on Fire by Hilary Sloin. Now, I could not actually find anywhere to confirm for definite that Hilary Sloin is part of the LGBTQ+ community, but it's all she's ever written about. This is her debut novel and it focuses on an almost entirely queer cast, so I think it counts. So I'm going to hope that you give this one to me because it is ticking as many of the boxes as I could, and I didn't feel comfortable digging around in her life anymore than I already had. Art on Fire is actually a fake non-fiction. It's a fake biography of a young artist who runs away from home when she's discovered in bed with another woman by her grandmother, and it's about kind of her artwork and also her kind of relationship with her family. And the thing that I find really cool about this book is there are big chunks of it which are fake articles and fake kind of interviews about her artwork, including like complete fake references, and it was so convincing as a non-fiction that it actually got nominated for a few non-fiction prizes before they were like, hey, this woman never existed. It's a great book, really fascinating, and more people should hear about it. It's such a wonderful read. It's amazing if you're interested in art as well in general. The next book I have to talk about is the prompt is a memoir from a religious tradition that is not your own. So this is actually Emma from the future jumping in. So I did have a book for this particular prompt, but it was only very loosely fitted in, and I couldn't actually remember how important religion was for it, so we've scrapped that book, and instead, because I very recently just finished Unfollow by Megan Roper-Phelps, that one actually fulfills this criteria a lot more, so I've kind of jumped in to override what past Emma said. So Unfollow is the memoir of Megan, who her grandfather actually set up the Westboro Baptist Church, which is a very extremist Baptist Christian church that is very intense with its kind of anti lots of things rhetoric. They kind of try to spread a lot of hate in the world. They're very like everyone's going to hell. They have a lot of they're kind of very homophobic. They also boycott and picket lots of things and are very, very vocal with their hatred. And the memoir is Megan's time like in the church, growing up in that environment with her family, and then also starting to question what she was being told, and then kind of the process of her leaving and now becoming really an advocate for talking like how to open up conversations about religion, extremism, and sort of dogmatic groups in general. It is more memoir than like anything about extremism in particular. Kind of the last few chapters do talk about some of the traits of it, but it really is about her personal experiences, and I think she does an incredibly good job of remaining very objective about her family. It's not about her turning around and slamming everything that her family's ever done and saying that they are just terrible people, nor is it about her putting on rose-tinted glasses and being like, I know that they've done bad stuff, but I like it's all completely fine. It's a really honest kind of look at what it means to kind of disagree with your family on such a fundamental level and want to leave them and kind of distance yourself from them, but still really love them at your heart, and how do you deal with an environment that is kind of relatively abusive in different ways. I think if you're a fan of Educated by Tara Westover, you'll definitely love Unfollow, and it was a really incredible, very hard-hitting read, sort of snuck in at the end of the year. I literally finished it like the day before the end of the year, so I just wanted to pop it in here. So now back to past Emma, even though this is now past Emma because time is weird. The next two I didn't read. One of them is a food book about a cuisine you've never tried before, and I didn't read any food books at all. Food writing is not something that I tend to read much about, so if you have any good recommendations for that, leave them down below. I think I've asked about this before in a video. It's a subgenre of non-fiction that I may need to try and get into next year, but then there would be yet another subgenre of non-fiction I read, and I don't know if I can do that to my TBR. And then the next one is probably the only one on this list where I'm like, I really probably could have read that, and that is a romance starring a single parent. Honestly, if I went back and really looked at all the contemporary romances I read, maybe one of them had a single parent, but it wasn't a core enough part of the story for me to remember, so therefore I don't think it really counts. This year I got really into contemporary romance. I've been deeply enjoying it, but I think it would be really interesting to read one focused on a single parent, just kind of changing up that dynamic, because a lot of contemporary romance is focused on mid to late 20-year-olds finding each other and like that love first time, and it doesn't necessarily fully break the mold, so I might want to branch out with the style of contemporary romances that I'm reading. The next prompt is a book about climate change, and for that I'm going to nominate Wilding by Isabella Tree. This is a book about the process of rewilding, which is a way of giving back to the land. So Isabella Tree and her husband owned a working farm, but it was no longer financially viable for them to run it as a farm, so they decided to give it back to nature and to kind of look at the process of how do you do that and how do you encourage kind of eco-diversity in general. And this is about climate change because it's quite a controversial idea and theory within conservation and kind of environmental science in general. But there are all sorts of various studies that suggest that it can be hugely beneficial for various things that are harming our climate. And also, when you're no longer engaging in some of the intensive farming practices, your carbon footprint does also decrease. So big chunks of it were focused on the climate change conversation and how this kind of fits in with that as a bigger picture. Also really lovely because it talks about like otters frolicking all the time, so definitely read that. The next prompt is a book over 500 pages published after 1950 by a woman. See what I mean by them getting very specific? And for that one, I do actually have a book for this. I was amazed. I was like scrolling through thinking like, I haven't read that many long books this year. Do I genuinely have one? But I do! And that is Queen Victoria by Lucy Worsley. This is a biography of Queen Victoria. Lucy Worsley is a very well-respected historian who has written a lot of different books about British history, and this one is focusing on a collection of very specific days in Queen Victoria's life and using that as a way of scanning kind of through her whole life, but really zooming in these little micro moments. Queen Victoria was a very complicated person who has very much been mythologised in British history, and this was a lovely look at what was going on at the time throughout her reign, and also just her as an individual and her relationship with Prince Albert and everything she kind of went through. A really, really fascinating woman in general, and I really like reading kind of classics from the Victorian era, so it was lovely to learn more about the woman who was reigning at that time. The next prompt was a sci-fi or fantasy novella which was under 120 pages, and for that I have The Test by Sylvain Neuvel. This was really, really cool and fun and quirky. There are a few novellas I thought about, but this was the only one short enough to actually like fit this criteria, and it's about a gentleman who's going for a citizenship test, but then something very dramatic happens at the test, and then not necessarily all is as it seems. I know you're thinking like, that's one of the worst summaries I've ever heard, Emma, but I don't want to give anything away. But let's just say it kind of stumbles into very like thought experiment-y, kind of ethical dilemma-y territory, and also kind of societal dilemma territory, and what do people want from their citizens, what do we owe a society that we live in, what would a government want from the people that it kind of governs. And for a book that is under 120 pages, it packs a lot of punch and asks some really fun questions, so I would definitely recommend it if you are a big fan of that kind of thought experiment-y, speculative kind of stuff that isn't necessarily too focused on plot and is more focused on just throwing out a bunch of information and kind of throwing out a bunch of questions and seeing where the conversation goes. The next prompt I did not fulfill, and that is a picture book with a human main character from a marginalised community, because I don't read picture books. So I have no picture books that fulfill any of these criteria. I don't think I'm going to read any picture books, and I'm quite content to not read them because I would like to have a family at some point relatively soon in the next few years, and I'm sure I'll read plenty of picture books then. So if you do have any recommendations for picture books, feel free to leave them down below, but I won't get to them for several years, let's just put it that way. The next prompt is a book about / written by a refugee, and for that I have The Ungrateful Refugee by Dina Nayeri. Now this one actually ticks it in two different ways because it is about the refugee crisis, but also Dina was a refugee who came over with her parents when she was very young. It's a combination of a memoir talking about her time as a refugee, and then also exploring what is happening and the different ways that kind of people can become refugees, what is the process, and what can the countries where they are fleeing to kind of do for this. This was another one I read for the BookTube Prize, and honestly, I didn't particularly rate it just because structurally I found it very kind of messy and confusing. It had all these kind of sort of spotlights on these different individual stories, but then we would kind of meet secondary characters of those later that I didn't realise the importance of at the time, and it just kind of felt a little bit all over the place and messy. There were some sections of it that I thought were really important and really interesting. One of those in particular was looking at kind of the charity work that happens within refugees and like the importance of human dignity when you are dealing with charitable outreach programs, and why that like simulating kind of a proper shop scenarios rather than just giving out care packages is really important, because it gives people back kind of a sense of control and ownership and identity that is really, really key. So I do think it's an important read and an interesting one, but I just kind of structurally, as a non-fiction book, because I was reading it for the BookTube Prize and kind of more critically assessing it in that way, I do wish it had been structured a little bit differently, because I don't think its kind of core message was conveyed particularly well, just because it was sort of so kind of jumping all over the place. The next prompt was a middle grade book that doesn't take place in the US or the UK, and for that I'm gonna pick the Animorphs books by A Applegate, because at least 4 of those that I've read this year take place on alien planets. This counts. It's absolutely fine. If you've been on my channel for a while, you already know about the Animorphs. They're a late 90s middle grade series about 5 kids who gain the ability to morph into animals if they absorb their DNA, because they get kind of wrapped up in this big intergalactic battle between the Andalites, who are the good guys, and the Yerks, who are this parasitic alien who have infiltrated the planet and are taking over people and turning them into controllers. It's really fun. It is surprisingly hard-hitting. It really doesn't shy away from tackling how traumatic it would be for kids to be involved in a war and what stressful situations that would put them in. Plus it's got a lovely underlying thing about learning about animals, so generally all around I really enjoy it. The next prompt is a book with a protagonist with a disability, and for that I have Get a Life Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is a contemporary romance where our main character Chloe is living with a chronic illness, and it is about the underlying contemporary romance, sort of the main kind of driving plot is she has had this diagnosis and kind of learnt how to integrate it into her life, but because of that she's then kind of stopped trying to do lots of things that she wanted to do. So it's about her trying to reclaim her life a bit more and to get a life, for lack of a better word, and it's about her recruiting a very cute guy in her building to help her out for it. I had really good fun with it. I think it's interesting representation. I can't speak to how good it is, and I know some people disagree with it, but you know, nobody's experiences of a chronic illness are a kind of monolith, and I think that it is generally a really fun read all round. I really like Talia Hibbert, and I actually very recently just finished the second book in that series, which is Take a Hint, Danny Brown, and equally enjoyed that one as well. I didn't get the next 2 prompts. One of them was a horror book published by an indie press. I don't know what counts as an indie press. I don't think I read much from indie press. Is this something I should change? I also barely read any horror this year. It's not a genre that I read that much of, but this is another one that I potentially could have ticked off had I thought about it in advance kind of thing, but that's not the point of this challenge right now. And then the next prompt was an edition of a literary magazine. I don't read any magazines, let alone literary ones, so sorry, that one was never going to happen. And then the final prompt is a book by an Indigenous author, and for that I have to balance everything because it's a big one. The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Treuer. This was another one I read for the BookTube Prize, and it was a phenomenal read. It is Native America from 1890 to the present, and David Treuer is part of the Indigenous community, and it is kind of a reclaiming of the history and a look at a lot of the atrocities that the Europeans who moved over into America have done to the native populations, and sort of how that's progressed in sort of more modern days since Wounded Knee, which is very much kind of considered to be the kind of death almost of the kind of Native American rights movement as such, and this is kind of a reclaiming of that. It also has a bunch of sort of biographical information, or autobiographical information I should say, from David, and it's sort of a lovely blend of the two. It's incredibly dense information wise, which is fantastic because you get to learn so much, but it did mean it was a very slow read for me, and it is huge, so just be aware of that before going in. So there you have it. I read 17 of the 24 Book Riot 2020 Read Harder Challenge prompts. I'm quite impressed with myself. I think it's really interesting to kind of see, especially given that I didn't know that going in. So I think I've done relatively well. Are there any on the list that, how many did you manage to tick off from the list? Is this something that you're interested in trying to do? I don't think I'm going to tackle the 2021 one on purpose. I think I just have too many other books that I want to read and too many other criteria that I personally like to try and fulfill myself. But it's really nice to look back on your reading and kind of be like, in hindsight, how many did I read? So that's it from me. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye.